which approach is better to deploy in 2021 fantasy football drafts? And should you go into any draft with a set plan going, I'm going running back, no matter what? The answer to that is no, and I'll explain why. But let's talk about which one of these approaches is better than the other, maybe. What spot you might want to try wide receiver, or running back in versus another draft slot. And are there even draft slots that cater to one of these approaches over the other? Let's say you could get Adams, Ridley, and Jefferson. I would honestly go wide receiver without even hesitation. I would crush it with those three wide receivers as my starting point. In fact, in auction drafts, I urge you to try and get the cheapest combination of three of Jefferson, Ridley, DK, AJ Brown. Grab all three of them in an auction and see what kind of money you have left to build those running backs up. I'm going to break all of that down and more. The Fantasy Football Show begins now.
This is the Fantasy Football Show with your host, Smitty.
Top 5 running back. You're watching the Fantasy Football Show. I'm Smitty. Take a lap. Wide receiver, running back. Let me start off by telling you one thing. Do not go into your draft saying, I'm going running back, or tell Bill from accounting who doesn't know what he's doing, Bill, you have to go running back. You don't get a running back in your first 2 picks. You're done. Look, you can win 1,000 different ways. Everybody knows by now that running backs are a premium. So I get tired of seeing people talk about it like it's some new wave of information that's hit the fantasy football space. Like, we know when you don't go running back early, let's say you go wide receiver in general, what you're telling somebody, if they ask why you're doing it, is that, hey, I know what I'm doing later in the draft. I'm going to land the James Robinsons. I'm going to get Clyde Edwards-Helaire on a bargain. David Montgomery is a top 5 running back across the board in scoring from 2020, yet he ranks in around 3rd round, 4th round value in 2021. Or I know my league and running backs always fall into the 3rd and 4th round because people draft quarterbacks in the 2nd round. Everybody's league is different. The people you draft with are different. In some of your leagues, people might not even draft a quarterback until round 4. Or you might have one quarterback go at round 3 and nobody take quarterbacks until rounds 5 or 6 or whatever. But in other leagues, you might have quarterbacks might go in the top 15. Are you talking about 6 points per TD pass? Are you talking about 4? Are you talking about -2 for INTs, -1? Like, it's kind of funny when people make these blanket statements about your strategy, how you're supposed to go running back, and yet the person giving the advice doesn't even know what your league is like, what the historical trends are for drafting positions. Like, look, bottom line is, do what's good for your league and draft around your draft skill set as a fantasy football manager. If you're amazing at landing running backs and wide receivers, but you always struggle to get that consistent quarterback play, then Mahomes at 3.1 makes a lot of sense for a drafter like you. You've got all these other skills that help you dominate, and yet you ignore the one weakness you have, which is maybe late QB drafting or scouting. Or on the flip side, everybody thinks I'm all about the early quarterback. No, I predicted Mahomes, I predicted Russell Wilson, I predicted Dak Prescott, I predicted the rise of Josh Allen. I'm a big-time breakout QB drafter. Sometimes I couple drafting a Mahomes at 3.1 with getting the next Josh Allen so I can trade one of the two later. You can cultivate the late QB drafting with the early QB drafting. But what drives me nuts is when people have these blanket statements about what you need to do. What you need to do. They know you better than you know you. And this comes back full circle to my procrastination here of running back versus wide receiver. Anybody that tells you that you have to take a running back with your first 2 picks, no matter what, without the context of what you're dealing with, without knowing that you're drafting at 12 and 13 or 11 and 14, without knowing the order of who's been taken, like Chubb's gone, not that I have reasons for avoiding him that will soon come out. Jonathan Taylor's gone. You're looking at maybe James Robinson, who's a fine pick at 12 or 13. I'm okay with that approach. But if you're looking at Eckler, James Robinson, a bunch of running backs like Miles Sanders and Akers and Swift, I don't blame you for going wide receiver. If you believe the second part of my whole process here is going to come true. the best players available, if you're talking about those running backs I just mentioned being the best running backs on the board, the best player available is going to be wide receiver, or Kelsey and a wide receiver. And we're not going to go there because today we're just talking about running back, wide receiver, which approach is better in rounds 1 and 2. But know that Kelsey's a fine 12 or 13 overall pick. You can win with that. But wide receiver is where the value is. The question is, if you do go wide receiver, how confident do you feel that a Clyde Edwards-Helaire will be there in the 3rd round for you, a David Montgomery, at least one of those two? In early January, Swift was falling to 3.5 to 3.12. Now Swift is going like at 12 and 13 overall, which is a little too high for me. But the point being is, if you were drafting like in January, which you aren't, you would have got Swift in the 3rd round. So going wide receiver, and Swift and Monty would have been fire. That doesn't mean there aren't Swift type players at round 3-4 turn now. If the answer is no, Smitty, you can't get a running back for anything at 4.1. In my league, it's all running backs from like pick 8 until the 4th round. Then the answer is don't go wide receiver. Context matters for even the advice I'm giving with my wide receiver approach. Context always matters. That's why blanket statements don't make any sense when you gotta go this, you gotta go that. So in the case where it's not going straight running back, wide receiver, running back. In those cases where it's not like that, we're going to have a few solid players left at the 3-4 turn. Guys, in my opinion, could have a cup of coffee with the running backs we're taking at 13-14. We're talking about Clyde Edwards-Helaire. We're talking about Antonio Gibson potentially, who I think as the offseason moves along, he'll be more of like a late 2nd, early 3rd round pick. But right now, depending on your draft pool, who you're drafting with, you could definitely, for right now, occasionally see Gibson fall into the late 3rd round. Montgomery, 3.9 to 4.01. That's his current ADP. J.K. Dobbins, 3.10 to 4.01. Kareem Hunt, about 4.8 to 5.04. Kareem Hunt could be your number 2 running back heading into 2021 with a wide receiver bookend approach at 12 and 13 overall, or 11 and 14. Get Kareem Hunt in the 4th round, you have yourself one running back. All you got to do is land that 3rd round running back. Kenyon Drake in the 4 or 5 round range. Leonard Fournette, 6-7 round range. AJ Dillon way outside the top 5 rounds for now, as I mentioned on a couple Instagram posts, which people had weird reactions to. Let's talk about AJ Dillon. AJ Dillon right now is undervalued. I put up an Instagram post where majority of people were like, hell yeah, I love AJ Dillon, good call. And then there was a little bit of pushback on whether he could be had at a cheap price right now, or that he could be considered undervalued because people already know what's going to happen with him. Not the case. He's not going in the top 5 rounds in early startup dynasty mock drafting, which tells me he still has room to 10x his value the moment Aaron Jones signs with another team. Now, Aaron Jones may not. That's why we're not buying Dillon at that 10x value. Don't even consider overpaying for Dillon. But just like we saw Swift go from like 3.10, 3.12 to now like top 12 or 15 overall. Again, I'm not loving the climb there. We could see Dillon come out of nowhere and 10x his value the moment it's for sure he's a starter, which is not a guarantee by any means. Aaron Jones could be back. Point is, he could be a running back we're talking about eventually if he's the lone starter. Now, Green Bay can still draft a running back. There's a lot of risk with AJ Dillon. When I put that post up on Instagram, it was talking about how he's undervalued now, not that won't change, not that I'll buy at the future price tag. I'm telling you right now, when he's absent outside the top 5 rounds in an early dynasty startup, he's got value. He's undervalued currently. I'm not saying take him at the 3-4 round turn in the examples we're talking about. I'm merely saying if you went wide receiver, and you landed Clyde Edwards-Helaire at 3.12, you land David Montgomery at 4.1, and later on, I don't know how far down river, but later on you draft AJ Dillon as well. That's what I'm talking about here. That's AJ Dillon's role in a team right now, a team build, where he's like running back 3 on your team and could potentially come out of nowhere and grab a hold of the second running back spot. Context matters. And the wide receiver can be deployed if you feel confident you can get a Hunt or a Clyde or a Monty. Who knows about Drake? There's upside there. There's also a lot of risk. We aren't even talking about rookie running backs right now. What we got to remember is that we put Najee Harris, we put ETN, we put Hubbard, Javonte Williams. We throw these guys into the mix, and all of a sudden, all the other players start moving around up and down. Now the odds of a Clyde Edwards-Helaire falling to 3.12 just got 2 slots more likely. I'm telling you right now, you give me Najee Harris and Clyde Edwards-Helaire with a Ridley and DK, or with a Hopkins and DK, or a Hopkins and Ridley. You give me Najee Harris and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, or Monty and Najee Harris, Monty, ETN, and Clyde, AJ Dillon, Najee Harris, and David Montgomery. You give me a stable of running backs in that range, in that bucket, mixed with those wide receivers. I'm okay trying the wide receiver from the 11 or 12 spot in 2021. And more often than not, you're going to be able to land it at the 11 and 12 spot. A little less at the 10, a little less at the 9, a little less at the 8. Around 6 or 7 where you would draft Davante Adams, you might be looking at another opportunity to successfully on the regular land the wide receiver. Justin Jefferson is one of my favorite picks in 2021, and I'm trying not to get too crazy. I'm trying not to ramp up his ADP too much, because we could knock it from a natural 3.1 to 3.5 up into like the top 15. We do that here at the Fantasy Football Show. We mock draft that much here at the Fantasy Football Show. So if you could get Jefferson in the middle of the 3rd round, let's say you could get Adams, Ridley, and Jefferson, I would honestly go wide receiver without even hesitation. I would crush it with those 3 wide receivers as my starting point. In fact, in auction drafts, I urge you to try and get the cheapest combination of 3 of Jefferson, Ridley, DK, AJ Brown. Grab all 3 of them in an auction and see what kind of money you have left to build those running backs up. One approach I'm most excited to try in 2021, in a league where Jefferson is completely undervalued and people are not in the know, and we get comments in the YouTube videos all the time where if Jefferson goes in the late 2nd round, people go, Jefferson in the 2nd round? I know a lot of us are shocked when we hear that, but we need to recognize that not everybody's as high on Justin Jefferson as we are, and we can get away with getting him later if we know the owners we're drafting with. Don't jump the gun on Jefferson in round 2 if you can get away with landing him in round 3. So yes, I would go Adams, Ridley, Jefferson, Hunt, or Adams, Ridley, Jefferson, Monty, or Adams, Ridley, Jefferson, Najee Harris, ETN, Hubbard. I'd roll with that all day long. I play in a lot of leagues, so I have the advantage of being able to try out a bunch of crazy approaches. I don't have to worry about, this being my one league. And a lot of the time I do that for you guys, so you guys get variation and you get to see things that don't work, that do work. So wide receiver can work from like 6, 7 overall. It can work at 11 and 12. It's obviously not something I advise at pick 1, 2, or 3 overall, or even 4, but where you draft Davante Adams is where you can kind of toy around with that. And again, where Ridley, DK, Hopkins go, it's fun to grab 2 of those guys. Now, running back, I'm not opposed to going running back, especially if you have a top like 1 to 4 pick, because your number 1 wide receiver in the 3rd round, if you go running back, is going to be such a good wide receiver. You look like you're going running back like a genius and pulling off the 3rd player as a wide receiver. Here's the conclusion. It's easy to go running back when you have a 1.1, 1.2. I actually do like the wide receiver approach in the 2nd and 3rd round turn picks if you get the 1.1. I like Ridley and Jefferson with McCaffrey over going running back, but that's me. But you can easily argue running back is pretty easy to do without fail at the 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Where it gets tricky is where you're drafting Davante Adams or Tyreek Hill, pick 6, pick 7. What do you do with that 2nd round pick? Do you go wide receiver versus taking a running back you don't like right there in the middle of the second round. If running backs aren't falling according to plan, according to your plan, or after the gap of where Adams and Hill go in the middle of the first round, down on to like pick 11 and 12. The bookend picks are almost the bookend picks. Once you get to that 11, 12 overall, you're back in a situation where wide receiver makes a whole lot of sense given the talent levels of the wide receivers compared to the talent levels of the running backs. This is assuming nobody falls to the 12 or 11 pick that shouldn't fall as a running back. So the question is, again, in your league, will you get screwed out of getting a running back like Clyde, Monty, Najee Harris, getting two of those types of players if you do go wide receiver at 11 and 12, 13 and 14 with your first and your second round pick? If you will be left empty-handed at the running back position, and you know that it does make it tough not to go with an Eckler or go with a James Robinson in that 12, 13, 14 overall range. I get that. I'm telling you, it doesn't always work to go wide receiver. But mixing in these rookies, my conclusion is that you're going to get a running back or two at least that you really like in the third and fourth round. Turn picks 3.11, 3.12, 4.1, 4.02 that look like Najee Harris, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Montgomery, Javonte Williams, Kareem Hunt, and then I think you're looking at a team that is just as good as the team somebody builds going James Robinson and a wide receiver, or James Robinson and Swift, or Swift and Akers back-to-back at 12 and 13, and then A-Rob and maybe a Mike Evans if you're lucky at the turn picks in round 3 and 4. Bottom line is the teams don't look that different. I don't think the running back from the 11 or 12 spot is going to have a huge advantage over the team that goes wide receiver. Ultimately, the truth is the 11 and 12 picks are just not as good, even close to as good as getting a 1 overall pick, a 2 overall pick, a 3 overall pick, because that third round pick gets so tightly attached to the second round pick for anybody that has the 1 or 2 overall. It's not comparing apples to apples. If you get a 1 overall pick, you have a huge advantage. You can go McCaffrey and go running back and get AJ Brown. You can go McCaffrey, go running back and get Justin Jefferson. Or you can go wide receiver at the second and third round, turn picks and go McCaffrey or Dalvin Cook or Kamara with your first round pick. And then at the bottom of the second and top of the third, you can go Ridley and Jefferson. You might even get DK and Ridley or DK and Jefferson. It's just a better pick. And my conclusion again is really from the 11 and 12 pick overall, it's just going to be a harder place to win from. Not that it can't be done, but I kind of like going wide receiver if I truly believe I'm going to get two of Clyde, Najee Harris, Hunt, Montgomery, J.K. Dobbins, maybe a little A.J. Dillon sprinkled in as my third drafted running back. Tell me what you think below in the comments. Comment, subscribe, tell your grandma, tell your friends, tell everybody about the Fantasy Football Show, and get on over to smitty1.com where you can find all of my content, all of my links to everything I have, all my social channels, my sleeperu.com link where you can get your news from me. Get your fantasy football news from me, because I give you dynasty and redraft takes with every piece of news I post. Let's go.
This is the Fantasy Football Show with your host, Smitty.
Top 5 running back. You're watching the Fantasy Football Show. I'm Smitty.